Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're going to be finishing part 2 of my review of the PWNAGE StormBreaker. Now this was a very unique mouse, given that this is a magnesium mouse and this is one of the only magnesium ergo mice on the market. I did have some pretty high expectations with this mouse because again, I do really like ergo mice. That's my preferred mouse style. And there was some very unique aspects to the performance of this mouse with the adjustable sensor and a lot of other really cool tech that's inside this mouse. So today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the PWNAGE StormBreaker to see what PWNAGE did right with this mouse and what PWNAGE could be doing a little better and how PWNAGE could make this mouse even better in the future. Now, before we get into it, I did want to say a big thank you to PWNAGE, who was kind enough to send out the Stormbreaker for review. Thank you very much to them. As always, with every review here on the channel, you get the truth and the brutal honesty of everything you see here, regardless of a free or a discounted unit. And as always, timestamps will be available down in the video description if you're looking for a particular topic. But let's go ahead and get started. Let's first talk about how the Stormbreaker performed in-game, and then we'll dive into the unique aspects of this mouse. Alrighty, now in terms of the in-game performance, the Stormbreaker actually did perform very well across the board in every single game I played. Again, this being an ergo mouse and being a little on the larger size, this was very comfortable for my hand size, so naturally the performance was very good because it's very close to my main, which is the DeathAdder V3 wired. I will say though, the Stormbreaker did have some uniqueness due to its performance because of the adjustable sensor on this unit. Like I talked about in my unboxing video, you can kind of use this adjustable sensor to form or change the way the Stormbreaker feels to your individual aim style, and this adjustable sensor did have a lot of dynamicness in terms of how it felt in different games depending on the positions. Now I wanted to talk about that adjustable sensor a little more because that is the highlight feature of the Stormbreaker. That is like the biggest selling point of this mouse, so I wanted to talk about that a little more in depth. Alrighty, now in terms of this adjustable sensor, for simplicity's sake and just to make sure this video wasn't like 40 minutes long, I only tested 3 different positions for the sensor. I tested the very top, the very bottom, and the middle. Now the adjustable sensor is on a slider rail on the bottom of the mouse. Technically speaking, there is infinite placements, like you can slide it pretty much wherever you want on this little rail here. So just to keep in mind, while I'm only talking about the top, the bottom, and the middle, there is a lot of mid-ground here and you can do a lot of fine-tuning to adjust this to your individual grip style. So just keep that in mind when I'm talking about this adjustable sensor. Again, I'm only talking about the 3 positions, the top, the bottom, and the middle. Just keep in mind there's a lot more adaptability and a lot of range of variation you can put on this adjustable sensor. Now for testing, I tested all 3 of the sensor positions at 40 centimeter per 360. Again, depending on your sensitivity and that kind of stuff, there will be some variance to how it feels. And depending on where you place the sensor on the Stormbreaker, there will be a bit of an adjustment period to get used to them. I found that the more aggressive or the higher you put the sensor, the longer it takes you to get accustomed to it. So keep that in mind. Depending on where you put the sensor, there may be a bit of a longer adjustment period. Now for the top sensor position, this was actually my favorite sensor position, I think, on the Stormbreaker. The reason why I like this sensor position so much is because I play a lot of arena shooters and high dynamic aiming games like Overwatch, Bad Business, and Quake. So a higher sensor position that felt faster felt a lot better in those games. It didn't feel as good for static games like Valorant or Rainbow Six because the mouse feels so much faster on the higher sensor position. It was a little harder to stay consistent in terms of static aiming, but for dynamic games it did feel very solid. Now I did find that the higher sensor position did feel best for more wrist or fingertip aiming because it allows you for a much higher degree of movement with the higher sensor. So if you move the Stormbreaker with your wrist or your fingers at the higher sensor position, there's a lot more pronounced than what it would be on a regular or a lower sensor position. And overall, the upper sensor position did feel best for more tracking focused aim. So as I mentioned before, very well suited for games like Bad Business, Quake, and Overwatch. Now in terms of the bottom sensor position, this was also a very unique one. It's pretty much the opposite of the upper sensor position, where while the upper sensor position allowed you a lot more freedom with wrist movement, the lower sensor position pretty much took a lot of that away because it lessens the degree of your movements. It actually felt a lot better for more arm aiming. So if you're someone who plays with your whole arm and you lock your wrist, the bottom sensor position felt best for that. It did make the Stormbreaker feel significantly slower. Again, I was testing this at around 40 centimeter per 360, and I would say it moved the Stormbreaker to feel more around like I was playing at like 50 centimeters, maybe even a little higher depending on how I was gripping the mouse. Now because the bottom sensor position is so slow and has such a reliance on your arm movements, it did feel much better in more static optimized games like Valorant, Counter-Strike, and Rainbow Six because it was much easier to stay on target. There wasn't as much of that wrist variability. It is workable for tracking, but the tracking is very, very slow. It was a just overall very controlled experience, which I did like, but it was very situational. I'm not playing as much Valorant and other tac shooters, more static optimized games as I am with more dynamic optimized games. So while the bottom sensor position felt good, I definitely preferred the higher one for my use case. And then lastly, we have the middle or the stock sensor position. Now this just felt normal, like just felt like every other mouse I used. It was a balance between speed like it was on the top sensor and the bottom sensor being more static optimized. It was just kind of a hybridization of the two. So if you want a more normal experience, you can go for the middle sensor position, or you can just slightly put it up and slightly put it down to get a little faster or slower. Again, high degree of variability, so you can match the Stormbreaker to your aim style. Now, one issue I do have with the Stormbreaker is that on the bottom here, you can see the rails, there's no markings or any way of you really be able to tell where the sensor was at stock. There's no like guidelines or anything like that to help you kind of gauge where it is. So one downside of this is that if you move the sensor from the standard stock position, it's very difficult to get it to go back to the original stock position, which is one really big downside, because again, this is a really cool tool of having this high degree of variability, but if you want to go back to a more balanced experience and have a middle sensor positioning, it can be very difficult to get it back exactly as stock. Also, it would be nice to have like little guides or something just along the mouse just to make it a little easier to show the individual points. That is something I definitely think they should maybe change on a future version of the Stormbreaker. But regardless of the difficulties of getting the positioning proper or getting it back to stock, I really do like the adjustable sensor here on the Stormbreaker. As I mentioned in my unboxing video, it's been a very, very long time since I've seen a mouse with a sensor feature like this, and I really do like this because it makes the Stormbreaker so adaptable and so variable to how you play games. It's a really awesome feature. I really wish we saw this on more mice because I genuinely think it is a really cool feature. So again, while it's not the best implemented version of an adjustable sensor, I really do like this. It is a really cool feature and is probably the biggest thing that makes this Stormbreaker very unique in opposed to a lot of the other mouse on the market. And of course, this is the selling point of the Stormbreaker. You're buying this mouse for this adjustable sensor. Of course, you are paying a premium for it. It isn't a cheap mouse, but I really do think that this adjustable sensor does justify the price because it is a really cool aiming experience on this mouse. It's truly unique to the Stormbreaker and nothing you're going to find anywhere else. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about the shape of the Stormbreaker. Now, this is a right-handed ergo mouse that is 122 millimeters long, 64 millimeters wide, and 42 millimeters high. It actually feels very similar to the Razer DeathAdder V3, which is my main mouse. It basically feels like a slightly smaller version of that mouse, but there are a lot of other similarities, but I'll talk about that later. Now, I will say the Stormbreaker was just ever so slightly a little too small for my hands, and I did experience some strain issues on the mouse, but that's just because I have these gigantic 7.5 by 5 inch hands. To resolve this, I was able to use the Soul Spacer shape shifts to shift the shape of the Stormbreaker to make it a little more comfortable for my hands, but overall the shape is very solid. Again, it feels very similar to a DeathAdder V3, just slightly smaller. Now, before we move on, I did also want to talk about contact zones or contact areas for this mouse. Now, with my very large hands, of course, I'm not the ideal shape for this mouse, but I did find with my larger 7.5 by 5 inch hands, the primary contact area for my hands on the Stormbreaker was a heavy emphasis on hypothenar contact. There was a little bit of a reliance on mid-palm contact and a tiny little bit of thenar, but the primary contact point, of course, was the hypothenar. Now, I am doing a claw grip. If you're doing a palm grip, that will vary a little bit, of course, but that'll be variant depending on your hand size and your grip style. For medium to small hands, the contact areas are going to be a lot more balanced between the thenar, hypothenar, and mid-palm. Maybe for larger hands, maybe a little more emphasis on hypothenar and mid-palm, but across the board, it is a very good shape for a lot of different hand sizes. So overall, the Stormbreaker shell will be very compatible with a lot of hand sizes. I think the only asterisk to that will be very big hands like myself. And of course, if the shape of the mouse doesn't really fit your hand size, you can do what I do and utilize these Soul Spacer shapeshift grips to just widen or change the ergonomics of the mouse to make it more comfortable for your hands. Now, since the Stormbreaker is a magnesium mouse, the coating is going to be a little unique. To be honest with you, the coating feels like a slightly textured paint, and the coating itself doesn't really give you a lot of grippability. What really gives you the grippability here on the Stormbreaker is actually the non-solid shell. So whenever you're gripping the Stormbreaker, the skin on your fingers will naturally kind of go into the grooves into the side of the Stormbreaker or into the texturing on the top of the main clinks, and that's what kind of gives you your primary contact area. Now, of course, when this comes to your palm, it's going to be a little different because the skin doesn't go in as much. I will say the contact kind of felt most reliant on my fingers going into the shell rather than like surface area friction. So I actually did have a lot of issues with gripping the Stormbreaker because the front of the mouse where my fingers were anchored into the caps and the shell felt really good, but the back of the mouse kind of felt slippery because there was nothing really for me to grip onto, and the coating on the magnesium shell just doesn't really give you a lot of anchoring there. Now, I ended up putting on some grip tape on the back of the mouse. That really did help overall, but unfortunately the Stormbreaker doesn't come with an extra piece of grip tape for the back of the mouse, which is rather unfortunate. I have a feeling a lot of people, even if you do like a palm grip or something like that, are going to struggle with this kind of slippery coating, I guess you could say, because right now the Stormbreaker only comes with click covers and side covers. I definitely think they should add on like a circle piece to go into the back of the mouse because that would greatly help the overall usability of the Stormbreaker. Now, the grip tape here is actually surprisingly good. It's not as good as the grip tape on the Wise Owl Cloud, but for stock grips, it's actually very solid. As I mentioned before, it comes with 2 click covers and 2 side covers. The texturing is very grippy. It almost has like a pour-on stickiness to it, but the stickiness doesn't last forever. About 2 weeks into my testing, I did find that they kind of dried out, just overuse of my hands being on them, dust collecting on them, and them drying out in the air, but they still were pretty usable after the fact, which is nice to see. Another thing to note about the grip tape is that the grip tape will take away your ability to kind of push your fingers into the side of the mouse to get that anchored feeling, so you will have to rely on the stickiness of the grips, and that will degrade over time, so you will be better off using aftermarkets, of course. But overall, for stock grips, they are quite good. You'll just need to get some aftermarkets to replace them when they eventually do dry out. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about build quality and QC. Now, before we get into this, I did have to clarify a mistake I did make in my unboxing video. In that video, I said that the Stormbreaker was entirely made of magnesium, and that is actually not true. It turns out that the base of Stormbreaker is actually plastic, and the top of it is magnesium. Now, the entire thing is covered in the same coating, and it actually does feel very similar, so that's why I didn't notice it. Now, I will say overall, it's actually a fairly well-built mouse, but there is a lot of creaking in the base where the magnesium top shell meets the plastic base of the mouse. There is a lot of creaking around the sides of the mouse. The top shell, though, being of course made of magnesium, is very rigid, feels very, very solid. There's no creaking or flexing on the top magnesium shell at all. The only issue areas you're going to really feel is going to be where it meets the base, as I mentioned before. And even those areas that do have the creaking, it is very minimal, and it's only going to happen if you're putting direct pressure onto that area. But overall, in terms of build quality, the Stormbreaker is very solid. However, it does have one unfortunate design flaw, at least on my units. Now, the biggest problem with the Stormbreaker's design, in my opinion, is the design of the main clicks. So if you look at the main clicks, you can see here on the M1 and the M2 buttons, they have this kind of lip on the edge that goes over to meet the side of the shell. I know I've talked about this at length before when I covered keychron mice in the past, and why this is a very bad thing. And the exact same thing that's happening on the keychron mice is happening here, where you do have issues where sometimes your fingers can prevent or make the actuation of the clicks harder, specifically with my ring finger sitting on the other side of the shell because my finger's grip is so far up. I did have some issues with the clicks feeling a little harder to actuate than they actually are. But the other problem with this is that because they have this overhanging lip and because it's towards the front of the mouse, if you hold your mouse towards the front and your fingers are gripping up towards the front like mine are, you can actually cause the main clicks to shift a very, very large amount. Now on my Stormbreaker, initially it felt pretty good, but over my time of using it, I found that the right click on the unit got looser and looser over time, to the point where if I'm holding the mouse and I move the mouse and I move my middle finger that sits on my right click, the right click actually moves with the mouse, if that makes sense. So there's this kind of disjointed feeling with the main click that is very jarring and I really don't like. On top of that, whenever I readjust my grip, I constantly move the click because my ring finger sits right on top of the gap between the top shell and this lip on the right click, which is really unfortunate. As I said when I talked about the keychron mice with their kind of lip clicks, I'm going to be saying the exact same thing here about the Stormbreaker, where it's better to have the clicks indented because you prevent any issues with people like myself who have larger hands who will kind of push the clicks and cause them to wobble. It's very, very unfortunate to see this on the Stormbreaker because if the clicks were indented, this mouse would feel 400 times better, but this jiggly kind of loose right click is very, very jarring, especially in game, because it feels like something's loose on the mouse, and I just really hate that feeling, and that really did heavily impact the feeling of the mouse overall. So that is one thing I would really like PWNAGE to change on future versions of the Stormbreaker. Now, one of the other issues I have with the Stormbreaker from a design and a visual standpoint is going to be the battery cables. Now, the mouse looks beautiful. It is a gorgeous looking mouse, as I said in my unboxing video, but if you look inside the shell, there are these colored battery cables. For a mouse of this price, I expect these cables to be blacked out, especially considering that PWNAGE took the time to black out the rest of the PCB. They even put a battery cover on the battery so you wouldn't see that in the shell. They did all that attention to detail to make the mouse look really nice, but then you have these battery cables that just stick out like a sore thumb. This, in my opinion, is unacceptable given the price of this mouse. These cables should be blacked out, even just paint them black, just something so they don't stand out as much. I know, again, this is very much like an aesthetics visual thing, but given the price of this mouse, I expect these to be black. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of build quality and QC is that because the mouse is not a solid shell, you will have issues with dirt and grime filling in these holes over time. Now, on the plus side, it is incredibly easy to open this mouse, and you can actually clean the top of the mouse very, very easily, which is a really nice attention to detail. So props to PWNAGE that they've made this mouse very serviceable, but just like any other non-solid shell mouse, over time this mouse will get pretty grimy. You will of course have to clean it every couple months, and on top of that, if you are someone who has a lot of pets like myself, I have 3 cats, cat hair, dust, and that kind of stuff will find its way into the mouse every once in a while. So be sure to just take a can of compressed air and blow the Stormbreaker out every once in a while, just to make sure you don't get a piece of hair in your sensor or somewhere inside your mouse. Alrighty, I also wanted to talk about the weight here on the Stormbreaker. Now, PWNAGE is advertising the Stormbreaker as coming in at around 49 plus minus 2 grams. My unit with the stock skates weighs in more around the 50.4 gram range, which in all honesty is completely fine. Again, well within the plus minus 2 grams. And as I mentioned in my unboxing video, this mouse feels a lot lighter than 50 grams. I guess it's because the mouse has that like metallic shine. You expect the mouse to feel a lot heavier than it is, but this mouse coming in at 50.4 grams is completely fine. It's a really good weight, and again, considering how big this mouse is, because it is an ergo mouse, it's very impressive to see this weight. Maybe in the future on a second version of Stormbreaker we'll see even lighter, maybe coming in more around the 45 gram range, but for my personal taste, the 50.4 gram weight is perfectly fine, no complaints. All right, now let's talk about the main clicks here on the Stormbreaker. Now, keeping in line with the Stormbreaker similarities to the Razor Death Adder V3, the main clicks are going to be very similar. So there's very large clicks. They do have the same coating as the rest of the shell, and they do have this kind of etch design into them, which is really nice to see. It does give a little bit of grippability. The main clicks do have a slight indentation to just guide your fingers towards the center of the click, which is great to see. Now, in terms of the click feeling, I'll give you a little sound test here. Now, the main click switch here is going to be an Omron switch. Now, these are binned Omrons that PWNAGE is binning themselves, which is nice to see. So they're going to be very good quality switches. They do feel very solid. They are a little on the heavier side, again, keeping in line with the similarity to the Death Adder V3. So they're going to be very similar to that click. They do have a slight bit of pre-travel and a little bit of post-travel, but they have a really good rebound and they're just a very solid overall click. The clicks are well anchored, I will say, aside from the right button, which is just super loose. The left button is really good, but the right button just keeps getting looser and looser the longer I use it. So overall, on any other unit without the weird issues with the right click being a little loose, the clicks are going to feel very solid. Again, a little on the heavier side, but a very, very good implementation overall. All right, now next up, let's talk about the side buttons. Again, keeping in line with the similarities to the Death Adder V3, the side buttons are almost exactly the same as the side buttons on the Death Adder V3. These large semi-chip-like design buttons that are flat on the top. Now, I really do like this side button design. I really do like the feeling of them. Now, these are sharing the same coating as the rest of the mouse, but they are not magnesium. These are actually made out of plastic. I'll give you a little sound test here. Now, the weird thing about these side buttons is that the side buttons are insanely high actuation. I haven't been able to figure out why they're so high, but clicking in the side buttons feels like you're hitting a scroll wheel click, if that makes sense, in terms of its resistance. Now, it does loosen over time, but it is still a very, very high actuation for a side button. So much so where I actually unbound the side buttons when I was testing this mouse because they were too unreliable for me to use, because I'd have to physically change the way I was holding the mouse to actually hit the side buttons. Now, I thought that maybe this extremely high actuation click was caused by like a weird switch choice or something, but it turns out that inside the Stormbreaker is just using standard Omrons for the side buttons, so I don't really know why the side buttons are so high in terms of their actuation. I haven't been able to find a reason for it. There's nothing on the Stormbreaker here that's different from like any other side click implementation. I can't figure out why they're so high actuation, but on the plus side, they do have a really good rebound, which is nice to see. They are also pretty well stabilized. There's not a lot of play on the side buttons, which is good to see, and again, I really do like the shape of them, but the side buttons are just way too heavy to be reliably used. If they were the same actuation weight as the Death Adder V3 side buttons, they'd be like a 10 out of 10 in my opinion. So unfortunately, this is probably going to be the weakest button on the entire Stormbreaker, which is a shame because they did a lot of things right in terms of the shape and the feeling of these side buttons, but the actuation weight is just way too high. It definitely needs to be lessened on a future version of the Stormbreaker. Now, next up, let's talk about one of the highlights on the Stormbreaker, which is actually going to be the scroll wheel, ironically enough. Now, this scroll wheel is using a TTC 13mm encoder. The scroll wheel texture is this hard rubber kind of like semi-crescent texture. It all goes in a linear pattern. I actually do really like the feeling of the scroll wheel. It actually has a really good texture on it, really good grip. The scroll weight is about a medium to high with very, very pronounced scroll points, but I do actually really like this. It is on the higher side. It's not nearly as loud as like the Vaxi or Zowie scroll wheels, but it is definitely a little more audible than other scroll wheels we've seen. Overall, the scroll wheel feels very good. I do like this more tense, kind of more pronounced scrolling. It does feel very, very solid. Now, keeping in line with the similarities from the Death Adder V3, the scroll wheel click is also very easy to actuate. It's very similar to the main clicks, maybe even a little lighter than the main clicks. It is using the same Kale pillar switch as the Death Adder V3 was using as well, so the scroll wheel is very, very easy to actuate, which is a nice change of pace. But overall, the scroll wheel and the scroll wheel click implementation is very solid. Probably one of the best scroll wheel implementations I've felt on a mouse in a very, very long time. So props to PWNAGE, they've done a really good job with that here. Now, so it's a surprise to no one, the Stormbreaker is using the same bread and butter combo we see on every single other high performance mouse on the market. So it's using an unlocked PAW 3395 with the 26K max DPI and is using a Nordic 52840 MCU. As I mentioned in my performance, overall the implementation is very solid, no issues with any kind of sensor issues or interference issues. It just overall felt very good, very responsive. The high polling rate implementation is also very good. Unfortunately, I was only able to test the 2K polling as 4K is currently disabled on the software. Now, PWNAGE is working on a web-based software and they'll be bringing the 4K back with the web-based version of their software. So unfortunately, while I wasn't able to test the 4K for this review, the 2K implementation was very solid across the board. No issues with that. It felt very, very good. All right, now next up, let's talk about the battery and battery life. Now, the Stormbreaker is using a 300 mAh battery and it is advertised as getting getting 120 hours for general use and 60 hours for gaming, which is surprisingly low for a 300 milliamp hour battery. Now, in terms of how it actually performed, for gaming use case on 1K polling, it lasted around 55 hours, give or take. And then on the 2K polling rate, it lasted around 42.7 hours. So again, there was a big hit there due to the higher polling rate. Now, one thing I did notice about the Stormbreaker is that in the software, this mouse is auto set to sleep every 30 seconds, which is very, very low for a gaming mouse. I would highly recommend adjusting that to a minute or even higher just to be safe. But I have a feeling this is how they're getting their 120 hours of general use, because again, the gaming performance is very low for a 300 milliamp hour battery. And I have a feeling the only way they're kind of stretching those numbers is because of the auto sleep. So that is unfortunate to see. The battery definitely needs a lot of optimization because the battery life is very bad for a 300 milliamp hour battery. But on the plus side, the battery is very easy to service on this unit. So if you wanted to put in a bigger battery, you absolutely could. Of course, that will affect the weight of the mouse, but because the mouse is only coming in at 50.4 grams, at least on my unit, you can easily add in a bigger battery without impacting the weight of the Stormbreaker too much. Now, in terms of charging, the Stormbreaker does charge via a standard sized USB-C cable, which is universal. It is compatible with other cables from other brands, which is great to see. In terms of how quickly it charges from around empty, I think it was around like 4% to full in around 2 hours, but that will vary based on your setup. So charging is great. Unfortunately, the battery life, as I mentioned before, is very poor. Hopefully we'll see some improvements on that in the future. Alrighty, and lastly, I want to talk about repairability here on the Stormbreaker. Now, as I mentioned earlier when I talked about build quality and QC, it is very, very easy to open this mouse and to clean it and service it. You do need to remove the base screws to get into the unit, which is pretty par for the course, but the mouse is very, very easy to open and very easy to service, which is great to see. The battery is very easy to replace, as I mentioned before, and it's pretty easy to service the rest of the unit. But unfortunately, PWNAGE does not sell replacement parts for the Stormbreaker outside of the warranty. So unfortunately, if you do want to buy a part for this unit after the warranty period, you will not be able to do so unless you rely on aftermarkets or third parties, which is unfortunate to see. As always, with everything I cover here on the channel, I will be doing a full teardown of the Stormbreaker. So if you want to see how to take this mouse apart and how to service it yourself and see what's on the inside and see how they implemented this really cool adjustable sensor, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss my teardown video coming out very soon. Alrighty, now in terms of final thoughts, I'm in a bit of a unique position here because as of this review a couple days ago when I was finalizing my script, I was going to go record this video, and then I saw on Twitter that PWNAGE released a new kind of announcement saying they're actually making a new version of the Stormbreaker. So they're coming out with a Platinum Stormbreaker that is going to have a bunch of improvements, fixing a lot of the issues I talked in this video on that newer version. So depending on how many things PWNAGE fixes from my list on top of the list they already put out on Twitter, that mouse would be much easier for me to recommend. I'll do my best to see if I can get my hands on a review unit for that mouse so I can talk about the improvements and see what's improved in terms of the battery performance and the 4K polling and the web-based software and all that kind of stuff, because I really like to see what the newer version of Stormbreaker looks like. But as of right now, the V1 Stormbreaker is hard to justify. Again, I love this adjustable sensor, but there's just too many flaws with this mouse for me to recommend it. But that is going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much to PWNAGE, who was kind enough to send over a Stormbreaker for me to review. I really appreciate that. Again, I have very high hopes for the V2 or the Platinum Stormbreaker, and I really hope that mouse is going to be a much more complete package, because again, this adjustable sensor is such a cool feature. I love the way this mouse feels. I just wish it was a little more complete, but we'll have to see what the future holds for PWNAGE. Thank you very much for watching this episode of the mel0n review. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to directly support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube. That is the best way to directly support the channel, or you can use my affiliate links down in the video description at Lethal Gaming Gear, TJ Exclusives, and Raven mouse pads to help support the channel. And as I mentioned earlier, if you would like to see how this mouse is built on the inside, how to disassemble it and service it yourself, be sure to check out my teardown video coming out in a couple days after this video goes live. But that's everything for today. Thank you very much for watching as always, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.